A widow stood alone in the cold, and the whole town had already decided what she was. She was a burden. She was a problem. She was the kind of woman that respectable doors close against, quietly, firmly, without apology. And on the night that mattered most, 14 people would be alive because every single one of those doors had been wrong. But that night was still months away, and right now, Maren Voss had $43, a 7-year-old daughter, and an address that no longer existed. The stagecoach had pulled away before she realized it. One moment it was there, the last familiar thing in the world. And then it was gone, swallowed by dust and distance, leaving her standing in front of a blackened lot where a boarding house used to be. The building had burned sometime in the summer. Nobody had thought to write and tell her. Why would they? She was nobody here. She was nobody anywhere. Wren stood beside her, small and serious, one hand gripping the handle of the carpet bag, the other wrapped around 2 fingers of her mother's hand. She didn't cry. She was 7 years old, and she had already learned that crying didn't change the shape of things. "Mama," she said. "I see it," Maren said. She saw it. She saw all of it. The charred timber, the ash that the wind had spread thin across the ground, the gap where a door used to be. She saw the afternoon light going orange and low over the ridge to the west. She saw the faces in the windows of the buildings across the street, watching with the flat, careful curiosity of people who had learned to stay out of other people's trouble. She had $43. Her husband's savings, recovered from a coffee tin buried beneath the floor of their cabin 2 states away, after the fever took him in the spring. $43 to last until she found work. $43 between her daughter and the street. She picked up her bag. She took Wren's hand. She walked. The first boarding house she tried had a sign in the window. Rooms available. The woman who answered the door looked at Maren, looked at Wren, and said the rooms had just been taken. All of them. This morning. The second had no sign. The man who answered listened to Maren's question, then looked past her toward Wren, and something shifted in his expression. Not cruelty, exactly. Something quieter and worse. Pity mixed with resolution. "We don't take children," he said. "House rule." The third was Harriet Gould's place, the largest on the main street, with clean curtains and a painted porch, and window boxes that must have held flowers in warmer months. Maren knocked. She waited. She heard footsteps. The door opened. Harriet Gould was a woman in her 50s, solid and composed, with the kind of face that had made many decisions and regretted very few of them. She looked at Maren. She looked at Wren. She looked at the carpet bag. "No widows," she said. "No children. They bring bad luck and worse debt." And she closed the door. Not with anger. That was the thing that stayed with Maren long after. Not with anger, not with contempt, just with the calm efficiency of someone disposing of something that didn't belong. The curtains in the window beside the door shifted. Then went still. What Maren didn't know, what she had no way of knowing as she stood on that painted porch with the last of the afternoon light dying behind the ridge, was that the woman who had just closed that door would one day stand in front of her door, in the dark, in the cold, with nowhere left to go. But that story belongs to a different night. And there was something else Maren didn't know. Something folded into the paper she carried in her bag, a paper her husband had pressed into her hand on the last night she ever saw him clearly, before the fever took his words and then took everything else. She hadn't read it yet. She had meant to burn it the morning she left. Some part of her had believed that reading it would make the leaving too real, the loss too final. So she had folded it smaller and smaller and pushed it to the bottom of the bag, beneath Wren's spare dress and the tin of buttons that had belonged to her mother. She didn't know yet what was written on that paper, but it would save 14 lives before the winter was over. She found work within a week. Not the work she'd hoped for, but hope, she was learning, was a currency that spent down fast in a mining town. The sorting house at the edge of the gulch needed hands. Women's hands, small and quick, to pull waste rock from ore on belts that ran 12 hours without stopping. The pay was just over $1 a day. The dust was constant. The foreman, a weathered man named Webb, told her on her first morning what he told everyone. Most women last about 3 months before the cough starts winning, he said, not unkindly. Just as a fact, the way a man might tell you the road ahead has a bad stretch. Marin looked at him steadily. Then I'll need to find something better before 3 months, she said. Webb almost smiled. Almost. From the doorway of the sorting house, on clear afternoons, she could see the ridge to the north, the high granite shelf above the camp where the waste piles ended and the wild ground began. And rising from that ridge, every day, every evening, every cold morning, thin columns of white vapor, curling upward into the sky. She asked Webb about them on her third day. Hot ground, he said, not looking up from his clipboard. Springs and vents. Whole valley sits on top of something that never cooled down right. Miners used to talk about bathing in the pools, back before the company owned everything worth owning. Does anyone live up there? He looked at her then, a longer look than she expected. The ones with nowhere else, he said. That first night, Marin settled Wren into the thin blankets of their camp spot near the warm creek, the overflow from whatever burned underground, and took out the paper, the one from the bag, the one she hadn't read. Her hands were steady. She had made herself steady. She had been making herself steady since April, since the grave in the spring mud, since the moment she understood that steadiness was no longer a choice, but simply the only way forward. The handwriting was her husband's, careful and small, the way he wrote when he meant something to last. She read the first line, then she folded it again, pressed it against her chest, closed her eyes. Wren was already asleep, one arm around nothing, the way she used to sleep curled against her father's side. The creek moved in the dark, warmer than it had any right to be. The vapor rose from the ridge above them, steady and patient, the breath of something ancient that didn't know what winter was. Marin looked up at it for a long time. She didn't know yet what she was going to do, but she knew she wasn't leaving. The cold came early that season, the way cold sometimes does in stories, not as a warning, but as a verdict. It arrived 3 days after Marin had found the spot on the ridge. She woke to the sound of ice forming on the creek beside the camp, a thin crackling like something fragile being tested, and she lay still for a moment, listening to it, thinking about the paper, thinking about what her husband had written, thinking about the vapor she had watched from the sorting house every afternoon for a week. Then she heard Wren cough. It was a small cough, a child's cough, the kind that means nothing in a warm house with a fire going and medicine in the cabinet. But they had no warm house. They had a canvas lean-to stretched over a frame of salvaged timber, and the fire had gone out sometime in the night. And when Marin reached for the tin box where she kept the matches, she counted what was left. 3. She lay there with the 3 matches in her palm and listened to the wind building outside. Wren coughed again, and this time she felt the small body shift and press closer against her side. "Mama, I'm cold." "I know, sweetheart. Can you make the fire?" Maren closed her fingers around the matches. She had been careful. She had rationed them. She had done everything right. And here she was, 3 matches and a sick child, and ice on the creek, and a wind that didn't care how careful she'd been. "In a little while," she said. She lay awake for another hour after Wren fell back to sleep, listening to the breathing beside her. Slightly ragged, slightly wet. The sound a child's chest makes when something is beginning to take hold. Not dangerous yet, but beginning. She had 3 matches. She had no money for more until the end of the week. The nearest trading post was a mile downhill, and she had exactly enough money to buy food or matches, but not both. And food had seemed more important yesterday. And yesterday, she had been wrong. She thought about the paper. She thought about what her husband had written in that small, careful hand, about the high ground, about the moving air, about the warmth that came up from below in certain places, steady and reliable, the kind of warmth that didn't need feeding. "You'll know it by the heat under your hand," he had written. High ground, moving air. The heavy gas flows downhill. If you're above it, you're safe. Test it first. Always test it first. She had read those lines so many times in the past week that she could hear them in his voice. She could hear the particular way he slowed down when something mattered, the way he always said the important thing twice, because he knew she'd be worrying about something else and might miss it the first time. Always test it first. She hadn't tested anything yet. She had only looked from a distance, from the doorway of the sorting house, watching the vapor rise from the ridge while Webb's clipboard scratched behind her and the belts ground on. Wren coughed again. Maren sat up. She dressed in the dark, quietly, her fingers clumsy with cold. She left Wren wrapped in every blanket they had. She climbed the ridge. The fissure was exactly where she had thought it would be. A crack in the granite shelf, perhaps 8 feet long and 2 feet wide, set high on the outcropping where the rock dropped away on 3 sides. She had noticed it because the snow around it was thin, because the ice that coated everything else on the ridge stopped a foot from the crack's edge, as if the ground itself were warm enough to push the winter back. She knelt beside it in the gray pre-dawn light and held her hand over the opening. The warmth rose against her palm, steady, constant, not boiling, not dangerous, but warm, the way a bread oven feels when you open the door from across the kitchen, moist but not wet. There was a smell, faint, mineral and sulfur, the way certain rocks smell when you chip them open deep underground. She took the first match from her pocket, lit it, held it over the crack. The flame burned straight and yellow. No flicker, no color change, no sudden hiss or gutter. The warm air rose around it steadily, and the flame leaned gently sideways in the current and went on burning as normally as a candle on a windless night. She watched it burn down to her fingers. Then she lay flat on the granite, face down over the crack, and breathed. She breathed slowly. She counted 1, 2, 3. She waited for the dizziness her husband had warned about, the heaviness behind the eyes, the sudden sweet sleepiness that meant the bad gas was pooling. She waited for 30 breaths, 40, 50. Her head stayed clear. The air smelled of minerals and tasted of something ancient, something that had been moving through stone for longer than anyone could measure. But her vision stayed sharp, and her thoughts stayed her own. And when she stood up after 5 minutes, her legs held. She looked down at the camp below, at the thin curl of smoke trying to rise from her neighbors' fires and failing, beaten down by wind. She looked at the fissure. She looked at the granite shelf, high ground, falling away on 3 sides, any heavy gas flowing harmlessly downhill into the empty valley below. "You'll know it," her husband had said. She knew it. She started building that same afternoon, after her shift at the sorting house and before the light failed. There was no money for lumber. What there was, scattered throughout the gulch in piles that the mining operation generated and abandoned without a second thought, was waste. Broken crates, splintered beams, warped boards, timber too damaged for use but solid enough in certain places if you knew where to look. Marin knew where to look. Her husband had taught her that too. Not about fissures and vents, but about making something from nothing, about seeing potential in things that other people had already decided were worthless. It was a skill he'd learned young and passed on without ever calling it a lesson. He had just done it, quietly, consistently, and she had watched and absorbed it the way you absorb the things that matter most. Without knowing you're learning, until the day you need to know. She hauled salvaged wood up the ridge in loads, 2 or 3 pieces at a time, her back aching and her lungs burning from the sorting house dust that was already beginning to settle into the tissue. Wren watched from the bottom of the ridge, too young to help carry, but old enough to understand that something important was happening, holding herself very still in the way she had when she was paying attention to something she didn't yet have words for. On the 3rd trip up, a voice came from behind her. "You're going to die up there." She turned. The man standing 20 yards away was perhaps 55, lean in the way that hard years make a person lean, with a left leg that moved at a slightly wrong angle, not dragging, but compensating. The careful gait of someone who had learned to manage a body that no longer worked quite right. He was watching her with the expression of a man who had seen a great many things go wrong and recognized the early signs. His name was Bassett. He had worked the mines for 30 years before a collapse took the proper use of his leg. Now he survived on odd work and stubbornness, and the particular authority of a man who had been right about dangerous things often enough that people occasionally listened. "The vent's up here," he said. "I've seen what they do. I pulled a body out of one, years back. A man who thought he'd found a warm place to sleep." He paused. He'd been dead 3 days before anyone found him. "I'm not sleeping in the vent," Marin said. "You're building over it. Same thing." "It's not the same thing." Bassett studied her. The compensation in his leg shifted as he adjusted his weight. "The gas collects," he said. "That's what people don't understand. It doesn't come out in a rush and announce itself. It seeps. It pools in low places. You go to sleep one night thinking you're warm and comfortable, and you don't wake up. Your daughter doesn't wake up." The word daughter landed the way he probably meant it to land. Marin looked at him steadily. "The gas flows downhill," she said. "This shelf drops away on 3 sides. The heavy gas can't pool here. It flows out and down into the valley before it can accumulate. The vent itself is drafting upward. The air moves." She paused. I tested it. Something shifted in his expression. Not agreement, not quite doubt either. Something in between. "You tested it," he repeated. "Candle flame, straight and yellow, no color change. 20 minutes face down beside the crack. No dizziness, no headache. Clean air. She turned back to the wood she was stacking. I'm not guessing. I'm building on what I know. Bassett didn't answer. He stood there for a moment longer, then turned and walked back down the ridge without another word. He did not offer to help, but he also did not leave the camp. Maren noticed from the corner of her eye that he positioned himself where he could see the ridge, and stayed there. She kept building. By the end of that first week, the frame was up. A simple A shape, 8 feet long and 6 feet wide at the base, tapering to a peak. Salvaged timber, warped in places, solid enough in the places that mattered. The fissure ran down the center of the floor, breathing steadily. The walls were the problem. Canvas would not hold heat. Scrap wood was too thin, too full of gaps. What she needed was mass, something thick enough to keep the warmth in and the wind out. She used the clay from the creek bank. The geothermal water that ran down from the ridge kept the clay deposits soft, even in cold weather, workable when everything else in the valley had frozen solid. She mixed it with dry grass and straw salvaged from the stable near the main road, then plastered it onto the wooden frame in layers, each one pressed tight against the last, smoothed with her palms until it was even. The first layer dried overnight, warmed from below by the fissure itself. She applied the second layer the next morning, then the third. The work had a rhythm to it. Scoop, press, smooth, step back, look. And somewhere in that rhythm, she stopped thinking about how much was left to do and started thinking only about the section directly in front of her hands. Her husband had taught her that too, though he had never called it a lesson. You don't build a wall, he used to say. You build this part of the wall, then the next part. The wall builds itself. She hadn't let herself think about him much since April. The grief sat in her chest like a stone she'd gotten used to carrying, and she'd learned that thinking about him directly made the stone heavier. But here, with her hands in the clay, and the warm air rising around her, and the smell of minerals and cold, here, somehow, it was different. Here she was doing the thing he had pointed her toward, and that made the stone feel less like weight and more like ballast, like something that kept her from tipping. On the 4th day of plastering, Wren came down from where she had been watching and set something on the ground beside the unfinished wall. A flat piece of slate, smooth on one side, the size of a small book. She looked at it, then at her mother. "For lessons," she said, "when we have time." Maren stopped plastering. She looked at the slate, then at her daughter, then at the half-built wall rising above the crack in the earth that was meant to keep them both alive. She picked up the trowel and kept working, but her eyes were wet. The walls grew, 18 inches at the base, tapering to 6 at the peak. She left a small vent hole at the top where the warm air from the fissure could escape, keeping the air inside moving, keeping it clean. Wren watched all of this with the focused attention that Maren had come to recognize as her daughter's highest form of engagement. Not asking questions yet, just watching, storing, the way her father used to watch a new thing before he decided what to think about it. On the 5th day, Wren said, "Mama, look." She was at the edge of the waste pile, 20 yards from the base of the ridge, crouching over something. Maren came down the slope and stood beside her. It was a dog, old or close to it. The gray-muzzled, deep-eyed kind of old that sits quietly and watches the world with patience rather than interest. Ribs visible, one ear notched, a rope around its neck that had been cut, not untied. Someone had decided the effort of a proper goodbye wasn't worth making. Wren looked up at her mother. "No," Maren said. "Papa always said—" "I know what Papa said. He said we help the ones nobody else will." Maren looked at the dog. The dog looked back at her. It didn't beg, and it didn't perform. It simply looked with the calm dignity of something that had already accepted the worst and was waiting without expectation to see what came next. She thought about a rope that had been cut instead of untied. "All right," she said. Wren named the dog Embers before they had climbed halfway back up the ridge. The name seemed right in the same way that certain things are simply right. Not because you reasoned your way to them, but because they arrived already finished. That night, the first night Embers slept inside the half-built shelter beside the fissure, he raised his head once toward the dark beyond the entrance and gave a single, low sound. Not quite a growl, not quite a warning. Somewhere between the two. Maren looked toward the darkness and saw nothing. But the next morning, she found footprints in the mud near the base of the ridge. Deliberate, measured footprints. The kind that came and stopped and considered, then went back the way they came. The man with the footprints came 2 days later, in daylight this time, with official purpose in his step and a leather folder under his arm. His name was Marshall Grundy. He was not a bad man. That was the thing that made him so hard to argue with. He was a man who believed in order, in the proper filing of the proper documents, in the principle that certain things were done certain ways because those ways had been decided on and written down. He had the face of someone who had never seriously questioned whether the written down ways might be wrong. He looked at the shelter. He looked at Wren. He looked at Maren. "You're on company land," he said. "Technically, the whole of this ridge above the third marker post is under company claim. The arrangement for camp dwellers has always been informal, but informal arrangements have limits." He opened the leather folder. "There's been a complaint." "From whom?" He didn't answer that. "The issue isn't the complaint," he said. "The issue is the structure. A lean-to is one thing. What you're building here is a permanent dwelling on land you don't own, with no documentation, no permission, no—" He paused, looked at Wren again, with the careful expression of a man arriving at the difficult part of what he had planned to say. "A child cannot be raised in a hole in the ground, Mrs. Voss. If you have no proper shelter, documented, permitted, appropriate, by the time the first real snow falls, I will have no choice but to make other arrangements for the girl." The world went very quiet. Other arrangements. 2 words that meant everything terrible at once. Maren heard them and felt the ground shift under her. Not from the fissure, from something else. The particular vertigo of understanding that the thing you were most afraid of was standing right in front of you in a leather coat with a folder under its arm. "She's my daughter," Maren said. "I understand that. She stays with me. Then build her something proper." He closed the folder. "You have until first snow." He walked away down the ridge with the same measured step he'd arrived with. Order had been established. The document had been delivered. His part was done. Maren stood and watched him go, and the feeling that rose in her was not anger, not yet, but something colder and more precise. The calculation of someone who had just had the terrain mapped for them and didn't like what the map showed. That night, after Wren was asleep and embers had settled beside her in the warmth that rose from the fissure, Maren sat outside on the granite shelf with the cold pressing down from above and the warmth pressing up from below. She sat between them and thought. She could go back down to the town, find a room, take work as a laundress, a cook, whatever was available. She could be warm. Wren could be warm. And then, at the end of 6 weeks, she would be where she had started, except with less money and less time. Or she could stay. She could stay and build something real, something that couldn't be dismissed as a lean-to, something with walls thick enough and warm enough that no man with a leather folder could look at it and use the word whole. She sat with the numbers for a long time, the way her husband used to sit with things, quietly, without rushing, letting the answer find its own shape. He had been the most patient man she had ever known. She missed him with a specific physical weight, the kind of missing that lives in the hands, in the absence of a particular warmth, a particular presence beside you when you needed to think. Then Wren's voice came from inside the shelter, small and soft, carrying the particular tone of a child speaking from the border of sleep. "Mama? I'm here." A pause, the sound of Wren settling against embers. "Papa said we never go back to places that broke us." Maren was quiet for a moment. "I know," she said. "Are we staying?" Maren looked up at the ridge, at the vapor still rising, pale against the dark sky, steady and patient as something that had never learned to hurry. "Yes," she said. "We're staying." She worked faster after that. There is a particular quality of urgency that is not panic, a cold, clarifying focus that burns away everything that isn't necessary and leaves only the next thing to do and the thing after that. Maren had found that quality somewhere in the week since spring, and she had been living in it ever since. Sims, the man who ran the trading post at the bottom of the ridge, nailed a small handwritten sign to the post at the edge of his porch where the trail began to climb. "Folly Ridge," it read, nothing else. Maren saw it on her way up that morning. She looked at it for a moment. Then she kept walking. Nora Blaine was less quiet about it. Nora was the woman who moved information through the camp the way the creek moved water, continuously, in all directions, with no particular agenda except the momentum of its own nature. The mud grave, she called it, to whoever happened to be standing near her when Maren walked past. Not loudly, just loudly enough. "She's building herself a mud grave up there, and she's putting her little girl in it." Maren heard it. She kept walking. Bassett heard it too. He didn't say anything to Nora. But one afternoon, when Maren was coming down the ridge with empty hands and a back that ached from the base of her neck to the top of her hips, she found him standing at the pile of salvaged timber she'd been working through, examining a beam with the practiced eye of someone who had spent his life knowing which wood would hold and which would give. He didn't look up when she stopped beside him. "This one's rot in the center," he said. "Won't hold weight long term. This one," he set it aside and lifted another. "This one's solid through. Better for your upper frame." He handed it to her. She took it. "Thank you," she said. He shrugged. "Doesn't mean I think you're right. Means I don't want you in a collapse on top of everything else." He paused. "I've seen enough of those." It was, she understood, the closest thing to help she was going to get from him right now. She accepted it in the spirit it was offered. The man who came 3 days after Grundy's visit was different from any of them. He arrived on foot, mid-morning, picking his way up the ridge with the careful attention of someone who wasn't used to rough ground, but wasn't going to let that stop him. He was narrow-shouldered, slightly younger than Maren, with ink stains on 3 fingers and the kind of precise, attentive face that belongs to people whose job is to read things carefully. His name was Aldrich. He was the town's only independent legal counsel, which meant, in practical terms, that he worked from a single small room above the assay office and mostly handled the disputes that the company's own lawyers were too busy or too uninterested to touch. "I heard about Marshal Grundy's visit," he said. "Most people have by now," Marin said. I looked at the claim records. He opened the satchel he was carrying and produced a folded document. "The company's claim on this ridge is registered, but the sections above the fourth marker post that includes the granite shelf you're building on were specifically excluded from the original filing. There was a dispute over mineral rights 3 years ago, and the company chose not to pursue it. The exclusion was never reversed." He paused. "Marshal Grundy may not know this, or he may know and have assumed you wouldn't find out." Marin looked at him. "Are you telling me this is my land?" "I'm telling you that no one has a documented claim to it, which is not the same thing as your land. But it means that Grundy's threat has considerably less legal weight than he presented it as having." He folded the document back. "I thought you should know." She looked at him for a moment. This quiet, ink-stained man who had come up a steep ridge to tell her something he had no obligation to tell her. "Why?" she asked. He considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "Because he frightened you," he said. "And the law works differently when people are frightened. I don't like what it does when it works that way." He left without asking anything in return. Marin stood at the entrance to the half-finished shelter and watched him pick his way back down the ridge, and she felt something that had been clenched tight in her chest for 3 days slowly begin to release. Not all the way, but enough. By the time the shelter was finished, the temperature had dropped to 15 degrees above nothing. Inside, it held 50 degrees. She measured it by the way her breath moved. In the open camp, it came out in full white clouds. Inside the shelter, just a thin mist, barely visible, gone before it reached the ceiling. The warmth continued its patient work below, indifferent to the season. She hung a square of salvaged mirror on the wall. She built a shelf from a plank with the wood grains still clean. She arranged their 3 cups and the tin plates in a row. She laid their blankets smooth. Wren stood in the entrance and looked around at all of it. "Mama," she said, "are we poor?" Marin looked at the mirror, at the shelf, at the 2 cups and the tin plates, at the air moving gently from the crack in the floor. She looked at Embers, who had already settled himself directly above the fissure and was exhaling in long, satisfied sighs that made Wren smile every time. "No, sweetheart," she said. "We are rich in what matters." Wren considered this with the gravity she brought to all important information. Then she nodded once and went to sit beside Embers. Marin watched her daughter and the dog, and the warmth rose around all 3 of them. And outside, the first real wind of winter moved through the valley. Soren proved over the weeks that followed to be exactly the kind of man who showed up without announcement. Not with declaration, not with any particular purpose that he named out loud, just with some piece of timber or a tool he happened to have, or once, a small jar of rendered fat that was useful for waterproofing the joints where the frame met the clay walls. He would work quietly for an hour, say something practical and brief, and then leave before the light failed. Wren had started timing his arrivals. Embers had stopped growling at him 2 weeks ago, which Marin had decided was the more reliable measure of character. But what she didn't know, what none of them knew yet, was that while she had been building these walls, Someone had been watching from the lower ridge. Not Bassett, who watched openly. Someone else. Someone who had been measuring the fissure and taking notes and making plans that did not include her knowing about them. That someone would become a problem. But not today. Today, the shelter was finished. Today, Wren was warm. Today, Embers breathed his long, satisfied breaths beside the crack in the earth, and the vapor rose from the ridge above the camp, and the walls held, and the cold outside meant nothing inside. What would you have done, the world seemed to ask, if someone had closed every door? Maren looked at the walls she had built with her own hands, from nothing, from waste and clay, and knowledge her husband had given her like a gift she hadn't known she was receiving. She would have done exactly this. She would have made a door of her own. 3 days of silence can tell you everything about a person. Soren had come up the ridge every other day for nearly a month. Then he stopped coming. Day 1, she didn't notice. There was too much else to think about. Day 2, she noticed and told herself it meant nothing. Day 3, she stopped telling herself things and simply accepted the fact that the ridge felt different without the sound of another person moving on it. That the silence had a particular shape she hadn't known was there until its cause was gone. On the morning of the 4th day, she saw him at the bottom of the trail. He was standing with his back to the ridge, talking to a woman Maren didn't recognize. Wide-shouldered, well-dressed for the camp, with the proprietary air of someone who was accustomed to being listened to. His brother's wife, Maren would learn later. A woman who had opinions about the ridge and everyone on it, and no reluctance about sharing them. Maren kept walking. She had clay to mix and a crack in the north wall to fill before the afternoon cold set in. She was almost at the top when she heard footsteps behind her. Soren reached her before she made the entrance. He was breathing a little hard from the climb. He stopped a few feet away and stood with his hands in his coat pockets, looking at a point somewhere past her left shoulder. "My brother says I'm making a fool of myself," he said. "His wife says the whole ridge is laughing." A pause. "She says it's been the main topic at the trading post for 2 weeks." Maren waited. "I just thought you should know," he said. "Why I haven't." He stopped. Started again. "It's not that I think you're wrong. About any of it." Another pause. Longer this time. "It's that I'm not sure I can afford to be seen being right alongside you. If that makes any sense." "It makes perfect sense," Maren said. Her voice was even. She had practiced evenness the way some people practice a craft, deliberately, consistently, because the alternative cost too much. He finally looked at her directly. Something in his face was asking a question he hadn't found words for yet. She didn't give him the words. "I have a wall to finish," she said, and she turned and walked into the shelter. She did not watch him leave, but she heard his footsteps go, down the ridge, away, growing smaller and then gone. And the silence that followed had that specific shape again, heavier than silence had any right to be. Wren looked up from the corner where she had been practicing her letters on the flat piece of slate. She had the careful, sideways look that meant she had heard everything and was deciding whether to say something about it. She decided not to. She went back to her letters. Embers sighed deeply and shifted closer to the fissure. The warmth rose around all of them, steady and faithful, and entirely indifferent to the particular loneliness of watching someone choose the easier path. Aldrich came the following morning. He was moving faster than his usual measured pace, and he had the look of a man who had organized something complicated in his head and was trying to deliver it in the right order before any of it could unravel. "I found something," he said, without preamble, sitting down on the low stool near the entrance that had become, by unspoken agreement, his place when he visited. About Grundy. Marin set down the tool she'd been using on the wall joint and turned to face him. He filed a surveying request 2 weeks after his visit to you, for the 4 ridge sections immediately adjacent to this one. He opened his satchel and produced a folded paper. The request lists the purpose as mineral assessment. Standard language, nothing unusual. Except that when I looked at the methodology he specified, it's not a mineral assessment at all. It's a thermal survey. He looked at her steadily. He's mapping the vents. The information arrived in layers, the way things do when they're complicated. Grundy had not filed the order to remove her. He had stood in front of her shelter, looked her daughter in the eye, delivered his threat, and then had not followed through. Not because he had reconsidered, because he had wanted her to stay. Because she had done the hard work of identifying a usable fissure and building something over it that actually functioned, and he had recognized what that meant before she'd had time to explain it to anyone. He was waiting for her to fail. If she failed, if the shelter collapsed, if the gas made her sick, if the winter broke her, he would be there to survey what she'd found and use it without ever having to acknowledge where the knowledge came from. And if she succeeded, he would file his survey, claim the adjacent sections, and build his own shelter while she was still fighting over the legal status of this one. Either way, she had already done his research for him. He visited you to frighten you, Aldrich said quietly, not to remove you. A frightened woman makes mistakes. A frightened woman might leave voluntarily. And if she stays and proves the concept works... He stopped. He takes the land next door, Marin said. And the knowledge, without attribution. She sat with this for a moment. The fissure breathed below her, its warmth rising through the floor into her feet and legs, patient and constant. Documentation, Aldrich said. If you've been building and testing and recording your methods, dates, measurements, the testing process your husband described, that constitutes prior knowledge and prior use. It would make any claim on adjacent sections much harder to prosecute. He paused. You'd need to write it down. Everything you know. Everything you did and how you did it. I'll write it down, she said. She was writing that evening. The paper spread on the floor. Wren asleep. Embers breathing his long, slow breaths beside the fissure. When the dog's head came up, not the low alert he used for strangers on the ridge. Something different. Something she hadn't heard from him before. A single note, held, focused on a direction. The northeast. Uphill from the shelter, toward the higher part of the ridge where the rock broke into open sky. Marin set down her pen. She went outside. The sky above the ridge was wrong. Not stormy, not in the way that announced itself with clouds and drama. Just wrong. A color in the high atmosphere, a yellowed bruise along the horizon to the north. The kind of sky that in her husband's mining stories had always preceded the worst nights. The animals know first, he used to say. Then the sky. Then the weather. By the time a person feels it in their bones, there's nothing left to do but get inside and wait. She went down the ridge the next morning before her shift and knocked on doors. Nora Blaine's door, the Teller family's, Old Marsh, who lived in the dugout at the end of the row, the family with the 3 small children in the canvas structure that had looked insufficient to her from the first week she arrived, At every door, she said the same thing. There is a change coming in the weather, a serious one. The animals are behaving unusually. The sky last night had a color I've never seen before. I have room in the shelter for several people if it becomes necessary. Please remember that. At every door, she received a variation of the same response. Nora Blaine shook her head with the gentle patience of someone correcting a child who had said something embarrassing. Clouds are clouds, sweetheart. The weather does what it does. Webb, at the edge of the sorting house, didn't even look up from his manifest. Animals don't predict weather. They react to it, same as us, same time as us. No earlier. Reverend Colt, who was sweeping his porch with the methodical satisfaction of a man whose faith extended to the predictability of autumn, listened to the full account with polished courtesy and then said, "Only Providence sets the hour, Mrs. Voss. I appreciate your concern." He resumed sweeping. The hardest was the family with the 3 small children. The father listened carefully, nodded several times, seemed genuinely to consider it. Then his wife appeared in the doorway behind him, and he glanced back at her, and something in his expression changed to the careful neutrality of a man managing competing pressures. "We'll be fine," he said. "Thank you." Marin walked back up the ridge. Embers was waiting at the entrance, still pacing, his nails making small repeated sounds against the granite that she had never heard from him before. Not distress exactly, more like language. The only language available to him for something that mattered this much. She put her hand on his back. He leaned against her leg and finally went still. "I know," she said. "I tried." The change did not announce itself. That was the nature of the worst cold in a story like this one. It did not build to a crescendo. It did not give the courtesy of a warning you could feel in advance. It arrived between 1 hour and the next, as if the world had simply decided. At noon, the sky was pale but ordinary. By mid-afternoon, it had gone the color of old pewter. By the time Marin finished her shift and climbed back up the ridge, the temperature had dropped 10 degrees in the time it took to walk from the sorting house to the base of the trail. She moved quickly. She pulled Wren inside. She positioned the canvas she'd been saving, oil-treated, heavy, weighted with stones at the bottom, over the entrance and pressed rags into the gaps along the frame. Embers pressed himself against the fissure and stayed there, all of his earlier agitation gone, replaced by a kind of focused stillness that Marin found, in some strange way, more frightening. Then the wind came. It did not howl. That was the word people used, howling wind, howling storm, and it was wrong. This was not a howl. A howl had a pitch to it, a register, something almost like voice. This was different. This was the sound of something structural giving way at enormous scale, the whole sky groaning under a weight it hadn't been designed to carry. It arrived from the north, and it did not gust, and it did not pause. It simply came, and kept coming, and kept coming. The canvas over the entrance went rigid, then concave. Then Marin was at it with her back pressed flat against it, bracing, while Wren sat in the middle of the shelter exactly where she'd been told to sit, with Embers pressed tight against her side. The temperature inside the shelter had been 52 degrees before the wind arrived. She watched the thermometer while she held the canvas. 50, 46, 42. The fissure kept its patient work. Warm air rose, steady and faithful. The walls held all that clay, all those layers, all that weight. and the wind found the solid face of them and had nothing to argue with. 39 degrees. And then it stopped falling. She held the canvas for another hour until the wind found a new angle and stopped testing the entrance quite so directly. Then she stuffed the final gaps with the last of the rags and sat down on the floor beside Wren and Embers and felt the warmth rising through the ground into her legs. 39 degrees. Outside, she did not know. She did not have a way to measure outside. But she had grown up in a place where winters were serious, and she had spent enough hours in the sorting house listening to the old miners talk, and she knew what this kind of wind meant. She knew that without shelter, without fire, a person in this weather had minutes rather than hours. She thought about the family with the 3 small children. She thought about Nora Blaine. She thought about Reverend Colt and his swept porch. Wren pressed her face against Ember's side and said, very quietly, "Mama, is it bad?" "It's bad outside," Maren said. "In here it's fine." "Will people be okay?" Maren was quiet for a moment. "Some people," she said carefully, "are very well prepared." Wren lifted her face from the dog's fur and looked at her mother with the particular attention she reserved for answers that weren't really answers. "And the others?" she asked. "The others," Maren said, "I hope will find their way to where it's warm." The first knock came 2 hours after the wind. Embers heard it before Maren did. His head came up, and this time there was nothing warning in his posture. He simply looked at the entrance and waited. Then Maren heard it. A fist against canvas, uncertain at first, and then harder. She pulled the weighted bottom of the canvas aside, and the cold came in like a physical blow. A wall of air so dense and sharp it felt solid. And in that wall of cold, backlit by a darkness so complete it seemed to have weight, stood Harriet Gould. Harriet Gould, who had closed her door with the calm efficiency of someone discarding something that didn't belong. Harriet Gould, in whose window box the dead flowers of last summer still held their paper shapes. Harriet Gould, who had not spoken to Maren since the day they met. She was not wearing enough. Her coat was fine, good wool, the kind that worked well in ordinary cold. But this was not ordinary cold, and the coat was insufficient, and she had been in the wind long enough that her hands were white from the wrist to the fingertips, and she was holding them at an angle that meant the fingers were not doing what she was asking of them. She did not speak. She simply stood in the cold and looked at Maren with an expression that had no performance in it, no negotiation, no version of itself designed for an audience. It was just the face of a person who had run out of alternatives and knew it. "Come in," Maren said. "Get warm." She didn't ask for anything. She didn't say "I told you so," though the words were there, available, true. She moved aside and let Harriet Gould into the shelter and closed the canvas behind her, and the cold was sealed out again. The second knock came before Harriet's hands were fully warm. Marshall Grundy. Something in his posture when Maren opened the canvas had the quality of kneeling. The formality was gone. The leather folder was gone. The measured, purposeful step that said order has been established was nowhere present. He was a man in serious cold who had run out of the comfort his own decisions usually provided. Maren looked at him for a moment. She thought about Wren's face when he had said other arrangements. She thought about the surveying request Aldrich had found. The quiet opportunism of a man who had recognized her knowledge and decided to wait until he could take it cleanly. She thought about the cold behind him, and about the kind of person she had told Wren they were. "Come in," she said. "Get warm." Nora Blaine came with her husband and her boy, the one she held against her side with the fixed, desperate grip of a woman who had realized, too late, what insufficient shelter meant. They were the third knock. The family with the 3 small children were the fourth. The father's face, when she opened the canvas, was the face of a man who had spent 2 hours understanding what he'd dismissed in 30 seconds that morning. And Soren, he came alone. He stood in the wind with the snow driving sideways past him, and he said nothing for a moment, and then he said, "I should have come back sooner." "Yes," Maren said, "you should have." A pause in which the wind said everything that needed to be said about the cost of choosing the easier path. "Come in," she said. "Get warm." 14 people in a shelter built for 3. 14 people pressed close in the warmth that rose from the earth below them. Warmth that had been rising since before any of them were born. That would go on rising long after all of them were gone. That had never been persuaded by winter and had never learned to fail. Maren moved through the space, organizing with the quiet efficiency she had developed over years of making small things work in difficult conditions. People near the fissure who needed it most. Children in the center. The canvas at the entrance held by the 2 men with the most mass and the most to feel guilty about. At some point in the middle of all of it, Wren appeared at her elbow. "Mama," she said in a voice that was too calm and too old for 7, "what do you need me to do?" Maren looked at her daughter, this small, serious person who had carried herself through so many difficult mornings with the patience of someone twice her age. "See Nora's boy," she said quietly. "He's scared. Sit with him." Wren looked across the shelter at the boy, who was pressed against his mother's side with the rigid stillness of a child who had used up all his available responses and had none left. She nodded once. She crossed the shelter. She sat down beside him without speaking and put embers between them. And the old dog settled in with the same long exhale he used at the end of every day. The sound of something completed satisfactorily. Maren watched it happen and felt something shift in her chest. Not relief, not exactly. Something older than relief. Something that had the texture of understanding arriving after a long journey. She reached into her pocket. She unfolded the paper carefully. "There's something I'd like to read to you," she said. The shelter went quiet. Even the wind seemed to pull back for a moment. "My husband wrote this," she said. "He gave it to me before he died. I've been carrying it since." She looked at the paper. "He worked in the deep mines, years ago, in country where the earth runs hot. He learned what I used to build this shelter, and he wrote it down so that—" She paused. "So that it wouldn't be lost." She read, not all of it. The personal parts she held back, the parts where his voice came through most clearly and the grief was sharpest. But the knowledge, the careful, loving, practical knowledge of a man who had paid attention to the world and wanted his attention to survive him, that she read in full. "The fissure must be on high ground. The heavy gas flows downhill. Always downhill. If you are above it, you are safe. Test before you build. The candle flame will tell you. Lie flat and breathe for 5 minutes. Your body will tell you the rest. Build the walls thick. The earth will heat what you give it something to hold." When she finished, the shelter was completely still. Grundy was looking at the floor. Harriet Gould was looking at her hands. Nora Blaine was looking at Wren, who had not moved from the boy's side. Bassett, who had come in without announcement sometime in the second hour, limping badly, frost in his hair, and had positioned himself near the entrance without a word, as if he'd always planned to be there. Bassett was looking at the paper in her hands. He knew all of this, he said, quietly. Not quite a question. He knew all of this, Marin said. And he gave it to you. He gave it to me. Bassett was quiet for a long moment. Outside, the wind continued its vast conversation with the valley. He didn't leave me money, Marin said. He left me the only map that mattered. The shelter was silent. The earth below kept its patient work. The warmth rose, and 14 people, pressed together in the dark, began to understand exactly how much they had almost lost, and exactly who it was that had saved them. The night was long in the way that only certain nights are long, not by the clock, but by the weight of everything happening inside them. 14 people in a space built for 3. The canvas at the entrance held against the wind by 2 men who had, hours earlier, been perfectly comfortable dismissing the woman who had built it. The earth below breathed steadily, as if it had been waiting for exactly this occasion and found nothing remarkable about it. Marin did not sleep. She moved instead, quietly, continuously, the way she had learned to move in small spaces with a child present, without waking anyone, without taking up more room than necessary. She checked the vent hole at the peak every hour to make sure the warm air was still moving through. She repositioned the canvas twice when the wind found new angles. She watched the thermometer in the light of the single oil lamp she allowed herself, and she noted the number, and she watched it hold. 39 degrees, 40. Back to 39. Outside, she did not know the number. She only knew what the wind sounded like and what that sound meant, and that the clay walls between that sound and the people sleeping against them were 18 inches thick. She had built those walls, layer by layer, her own hands. The thought did not make her proud exactly. Pride felt too small for it. It felt more like something settling, the particular piece of a thing that has found its right place after a long time of not knowing what that place was. Bassett was awake. She had known he would be. Some people don't sleep in the presence of danger, not from fear, but from the same instinct that kept them alive long enough to have gray in their hair. He was sitting near the entrance with his back against the clay wall, his bad leg extended, watching the canvas. She sat down beside him. Neither of them spoke for a while. Outside, the wind found the ridge, and the ridge turned it back, and the shelter absorbed what remained. "I've been in collapses," Bassett said eventually. Not loudly, just talking, the way people talk at 3 a.m. when they've stopped performing for anyone. 3 of them. The first one took 2 men. The second one took my leg. The third one I walked out of, but I don't know why. He paused. After that, I stopped going underground. Spent a long time thinking it was because I was a coward. Marin waited. Then I decided it was because I'd used up whatever luck a man gets. Another pause. Either way, I stopped trusting enclosed spaces. He looked at the clay walls, at the fissure in the floor, faintly visible in the lamplight, its warmth still rising. I've been standing outside looking at this thing for weeks, waiting for it to prove me right. And, Marin asked. He was quiet for a moment. "My leg is warm," he said. "For the first time in 3 years, both my legs are the same temperature." He looked at the floor. "That shouldn't be possible. According to everything I know, it shouldn't be possible." "It's possible because of the geology," Marin said. "Because of where the fissure sits on the shelf. Because my husband paid attention to the right things and wrote them down. Your husband, Bassett said. He sounds like a man worth knowing. He was, she said simply. They sat in silence for a while. The lamplight moved. Embers shifted in his sleep and made the low sound he made when he was dreaming. Something between a whimper and a sigh, as if the dream was not quite bad enough to wake from, but not quite good enough to enjoy. I was wrong, Bassett said. 3 words, flat and plain, with no decoration on them. No qualifier, no but, no version that softened what they meant. Just the words, offered with the directness of a man who had decided that honesty was the last economy worth keeping. Maren looked at him. You were working from what you'd seen, she said. What you've seen sits there and argues with everything new. It takes a particular kind of courage to let it be wrong. He shook his head slightly. Following a map in the dark, alone, with a child, and everyone in the valley telling you you're wrong. He stopped. That's not just following a map. My husband walked around it first, Maren said. I just followed where he pointed. No, Bassett said quietly. You didn't. You walked it yourself. That part was yours. Nora Blaine's boy still hadn't spoken. He had accepted Embers with the careful gratitude of someone receiving something they weren't sure they deserved, and he had stayed close to the dog through the first hours with his head pressed against the animal's side and his eyes open and fixed on nothing visible. Wren had stayed beside him without requiring anything of him. Not conversation, not response, not even acknowledgement. She had simply been there, the way Embers was there, offering presence without demand. It was Wren who noticed first. She appeared at Maren's elbow in the small hours of the morning, when most of the shelter was finally sleeping, and said in a whisper so precise it was practically inaudible, Mama. His hands aren't shaking anymore. Maren looked across the shelter to where the boy lay curled against Embers, both of them breathing in the same slow rhythm. The tension that had held his small body rigid since his mother had carried him in through the canvas was gone. Not resolved, not healed, but resting. Set down for a little while. Good, Maren whispered back. Wren looked at her mother with that particular 7-year-old gravity, the one that showed up when she was processing something too large for one pass. He just needed something warm that wasn't going to leave, she said. Maren looked at her daughter for a long moment. Yes, she said, that's exactly right. Wren nodded once, satisfied, and went back to her place beside the boy and the dog. She lay down, curled herself into the remaining space, and was asleep in minutes with the straightforward efficiency of childhood. Maren watched them, her daughter, the traumatized boy, the old gray-muzzled dog who had been left behind and had somehow ended up at the center of everything. The rope that had been cut instead of untied. How long he had waited, patient and unhurried, before Wren had found him. We help the ones nobody else will. She thought about her husband saying that. The way he had lived it, quietly, consistently, without calling it a lesson. The way you teach the things that matter most. Sometime in the deepest part of the night, the boy spoke. 2 words, directed at no one in particular, from the border of sleep. His hand was resting on Ember's back, and his eyes were nearly closed, and the words came out with the particular softness of something said before the usual guards are up. Good dog, he said. The shelter was quiet. Most people were asleep. But Nora Blaine was not asleep. She was sitting 3 feet away with her back against the wall and her knees pulled up, and the specific stillness of a woman who had been waiting, without knowing she was waiting, for exactly those 2 words in exactly that voice. She didn't make a sound. She put her hand over her mouth and she sat very still, and the tears ran down her face in silence, because she was in a shelter with 14 people, and she was not going to wake anyone over her own relief, no matter how large it was. Marin saw it. She looked away. Some things don't need a witness. Harriet Gould was the one who spoke in the small hours before dawn. Not to Marin, to the room, or to no one. In the way that the darkness sometimes draws things out of people that the daylight keeps safely contained. I had a woman come to my door the winter before last, Harriet said. She was looking at the clay wall, not at anyone present. Widow, 2 boys, older than yours. She wanted a room. A pause. I said no. No one responded. The shelter listened. She found a place with the tellers for a week. Then she left, went north, looking for work. One of the boys came back in the spring. Just the one. Harriet was quiet for a moment. He didn't say what happened to his mother or his brother. He didn't have to. The lamp threw shadows against the clay. The earth breathed below. I've told myself 100 times it wasn't my fault, Harriet said. That I didn't know. That there was no way to know. A pause. But I knew it was cold. I knew she had children. I knew she had nowhere else. She stopped. I just decided those things were her problem. The silence that followed had a different quality from the silence before. Heavier, and at the same time, somehow cleaner. The silence that comes after something true has been said in a room that was ready to hold it. Marin looked at Harriet Gould, at the face that had closed a door without anger, without cruelty, with only the calm efficiency of someone discarding something that didn't belong. She saw in it now what she hadn't been able to see then. Not a hard woman, but a woman who had practiced hardness so long and so consistently that she had lost track of when it had stopped protecting her and started costing her instead. She didn't say anything. There was nothing to say that the shelter hadn't already said. By existing, by being warm, by holding 14 people through the worst night any of them could remember. Marshall Grundy set something on the floor near the fissure sometime in the 4th hour. He did it quietly, without ceremony, while Marin was checking the vent hole and had her back turned. When she looked around, there was a folded paper on the ground. She picked it up. It was the surveying request. His own copy. The original filing, with his name and his signature, and the coordinates of the 4 adjacent sections. The sections he had been planning to assess once she had proved the concept for him. He had folded it in half and set it down without explanation, and he was now sitting against the far wall with his eyes closed, or closed enough to pass for it. Marin held the paper. She looked at him. She put the paper in her coat pocket. Not forgiveness. That was too simple, too neat for what it was. More like acknowledgement. He had done what he'd done. He had made the calculation he'd made. And now he had set the document on the floor of the shelter he'd tried to use against her, in the warmth that she had built. And that was a kind of reckoning that required no words to make it complete. The boy woke properly just before dawn. He sat up slowly, with the careful deliberateness of someone testing whether the world was still the same shape it had been, and found embers still pressed warm against his side. He put his hand on the dog's back, Then he looked up and found Wren watching him from 2 feet away with the patient attention she gave to things she wanted to understand. "Does the dog have a name?" he asked. His voice was thin from disuse, like a note played on a string that hadn't been touched in too long. But it was his voice. It was in the room. It was real. The shelter didn't erupt. No one cheered. No one reached for him or spoke to him in the careful registers of someone trying not to startle a wild thing. Everyone simply went very still, in the way that people go still when something has shifted in a room and they know, without being told, that the right response is to let it breathe. Wren said, "His name is Embers, but you can give him another name if you want. He answers to most things." The boy looked at the dog. The dog looked back with the ancient, undemanding patience that had been in his eyes since the waste pile. "Cole," the boy said. It was the name he'd been holding, Marin realized, without knowing he'd been holding it. The name that had been there waiting while everything else was too loud and too frightening to allow for naming. Embers, Cole, thumped his tail once against the floor of the shelter. The sound was quiet and solid and entirely sufficient. Nora Blaine made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh and wasn't quite a sob, but lived in the particular country between them where relief makes its home. She pulled her son against her side, and he let her. And the rigidity that had held him apart from everything since he came in through the canvas was gone, not all at once, but the way ice goes on a warming day, steadily, from the edges in. Wren caught her mother's eye across the shelter and said nothing. She didn't need to. Soren was the last to sleep and the first to wake. He was sitting near the entrance when the light outside changed. Not sunrise, but a shift in the darkness, the way night begins its retreat, not with light, but with a slight relaxing of the dark. He was awake and quiet and looking at his hands. Marin had been awake beside him for an hour, not speaking, just present. The particular exhaustion of someone who had held everything together through the long night and was beginning to understand that the long night was nearly over. "I'm not a brave man," Soren said. "I know. I let my brother's wife make the decision for me." A pause. "I've done that before, with other things. I thought I'd stopped." He looked at his hands. "Apparently not." "No," Marin agreed. He glanced at her sideways. "That's not very comforting." "You didn't come up here for comfort," she said. He thought about that. Outside, the wind had dropped, not gone, but changed in character, from the force that had been arguing with the ridge all night to something smaller and less certain of itself, the kind of wind that knows it's losing. "I came back because you're the most honest person I've met in a very long time, and I'd like to find out if I can be worth knowing to someone like that." He said it to his hands, not to her. "I understand if the answer is complicated." Marin looked at the entrance, at the lightning edge of the canvas, at the new quality of the dark beyond it. "It is complicated," she said. "But complicated isn't the same as no." He looked up then, not with relief. He hadn't earned relief yet, and they both knew it. But with something more honest than relief. The expression of a man who has been offered the chance to do better, and understood that it's an offer, not a guarantee. "Get some sleep," Marin said. "There's work to do when this lets up, and you'll be of no use to anyone exhausted." He almost smiled. Then he closed his eyes. She sat beside him in the warming shelter and listened to 14 people breathing in the dark, and the earth breathing below all of them, and the wind outside finally beginning, slowly, slowly, to decide it had somewhere else to be. Then, In the hour before dawn proper, a sound came from the back of the shelter. A sharp sound, a voice, low and then suddenly urgent. Marin was on her feet before she finished recognizing what she was hearing. A woman, the young wife of one of the miners, barely older than 20, who had come in with the third knock and hadn't said a word since, was sitting up with both hands pressed flat against the floor, her face white in the lamplight with something that was not cold and not fear, but something older and more fundamental than either. She looked at Marin across the shelter with the wide, clear eyes of someone who had just understood what was happening and needed it not to be a problem, and knew it was going to be a problem regardless. "It's early," she said. "It wasn't supposed to be yet." Marin crossed the shelter in 4 steps. She had helped her mother years before this story began, twice and then 3 times. She had been young enough that the memories were impressionistic. The particular smell of lantern oil and effort, her mother's calm voice giving instructions, the specific quality of waiting that filled a room when something was coming that could not be stopped or redirected. She knew what to do. "Wren," she said quietly. Her daughter was already awake. "Yes, Mama." "Take embers to the far end. Keep the children with you. Keep them calm, and keep them there." "Yes, Mama." The shelter organized itself around the new reality with the particular grace that emerges in enclosed spaces when everyone present understands that there is one thing that matters, and everything else is secondary. Harriet Gould appeared at Marin's shoulder without being asked and proved, in the hour that followed, that there were forms of competence that had nothing to do with whether a person had been kind. Bassett herded the men to the entrance end and kept them there with the authority of someone accustomed to managing people in crisis. Soren held the lamp, and in the coldest, darkest hour before the dawn, in a shelter built over a crack in the earth by a woman with $43 and a dead man's letter, a small girl arrived in the world with the unreasonable, magnificent insistence of new things that have not yet learned that the timing could be better. She cried immediately, loudly, with the full commitment of someone who has something important to say and no patience for delay. The shelter went completely still for 1 breath, 2. Then the sound of something releasing, not just in the woman holding her new daughter, but in the room itself, in all the people pressed into it, in the long-held tension of the night, finally finding somewhere to go. It went into the cry. It went into the sound of something new that had no interest in the cold, or anything that had happened in the hours before it arrived. That had only arrived and intended to continue arriving, and found the whole arrangement perfectly satisfactory. Marin sat back on her heels. She was shaking slightly. She noticed this with the mild, distant surprise of someone observing themselves from outside. Her hands were steady, as they always were when they needed to be, but the rest of her was quietly coming undone with something that wasn't sadness and wasn't joy, but lived in the place where they overlap. She thought of her husband's voice. She thought of the letter in her coat pocket, the full letter, the part she hadn't read aloud, the parts where he talked about Wren, about the child he had known, and the woman he had watched his wife become, and the things he had wanted them both to have. She thought, he would have liked this. She thought, he would have laughed at the timing. She reached out and touched the baby's head. The extraordinary, unreasonable warmth of something brand new. Then she looked up at the young mother. "What will you call her?" she asked. The young woman looked at her daughter with the expression of someone seeing the most specific thing they have ever seen. "Hope," she said. "Her name is Hope." Behind them, Wren's voice came from the far end of the shelter, quiet and clear. Embers, coal, is very interested in the baby. A sound moved through the shelter then that was nothing like the wind and nothing like the cold, and nothing like any of the hours that had preceded it. A sound that had no single source and no single meaning, but was made of something that 14 people, in the warmest place in the valley on the coldest night of the season, had finally allowed themselves to feel. It was the sound of people who had nearly been lost, realizing they had been found. Hope's first cry had not yet faded when the storm began, at last, to reconsider its position. The wind dropped by degrees through the morning until sometime past midday. The canvas at the entrance stopped pulling against its weights and simply hung still. No one moved immediately. 14 people sat in the warmth and listened to the silence that had replaced the sound they had been living inside for nearly 20 hours, and the silence had a texture to it, the particular thickness of air that has stopped fighting and is simply resting. Outside, the light had changed, pale and flat, the way light looks when it is filtered through clouds that have spent themselves completely and have nothing left to prove. Bassett was the first to pull the canvas aside. He stood in the entrance for a long moment without speaking, looking out at the valley below with the expression of a man reading a landscape the way other people read a page, not for beauty, but for information. What he read made him go very still. No one asked. They could read it in the set of his shoulders, in the way his hand tightened briefly on the frame before he turned back to the room. "It's bad," he said, "but it's over." The baby made a small sound from her mother's arms, a sound of no particular meaning, just the sound of something alive that had arrived in the world and found the arrangement acceptable. It was the right sound for the moment. They went down in groups, Marin last. She walked the ridge before she descended, moving along the granite shelf in the flat morning light with her coat pulled close and her boots leaving the first clear prints in snow that had drifted deep against the eastern face of the outcropping. She walked to the far edge of the shelf where the rock dropped away and looked out at the valley. The camp below was altered in the way that serious winters alter the places where people have built insufficient things. Roof lines that had been inadequate before the night were absent now. Canvas structures had collapsed under the weight of snow or been dismantled by wind. The paths between shelters had disappeared entirely, smoothed over into a single white surface that showed nothing of what had been there before. The warm creek that ran down from the ridge was the only moving thing visible, dark water threading through white, steam rising from it in thin columns that caught the pale morning light and held it for a moment before releasing it. She stood and looked for a long time. She thought about old Marsh, the man in the dugout at the end of the row. She had knocked on his door. He had waved her off from his window with the practiced gesture of a man who had survived a long time by not changing what worked, and who had therefore stopped being able to distinguish between the things that had kept him alive and the habits that would eventually kill him. Aldrich found her there. He had come up the ridge early, before most of the camp was moving, picking his way carefully through the drifts. He stood beside her and looked at the valley without speaking for a moment. "Marsh?" Marin said, not a question. "Yes." His voice was quiet. "They found him this morning. The dugout held. He just didn't have enough fuel. By the time anyone thought to check..." He stopped. Marin looked at the place where the dugout was, buried now under snow, indistinguishable from the surrounding white. She felt the grief of it land in her. Not clean, not simple, but with the particular texture of preventable loss, which is heavier than ordinary sorrow, because it carries the weight of the alternative, that didn't happen. He made his choice, she said. Yes? That doesn't mean it doesn't matter. No, Aldrich said. It doesn't. They stood in the cold morning air and let the weight of it settle properly without rushing past it toward the easier parts of the day. The man was gone. She had tried. Both of these things were true, and they would simply have to exist together, because that was the only honest way to hold them. She was not glad. She was not satisfied. She did not feel that the world had arranged itself into the shape it deserved. The world arranges itself into the shape it is, and the people in it decide what to do with that. She turned away from the valley and walked back to the shelter to begin the work that came after. The reckoning happened across the rest of that day in pieces, the way true reckonings always do. Not in a single dramatic scene, but in a series of small moments, each one carrying its own particular weight, each one requiring something different from the person receiving it. Harriet Gould came first. She came up the ridge alone, mid-morning, after she had returned briefly to her boarding house to assess the damage. She had a key in her right hand, and she set it in Marin's palm without preamble, without ceremony, looking at Marin with the stripped-down face she had worn the night before. No performance, no efficiency, just what was underneath all of that. "It isn't enough," Harriet said. "I know that." Marin closed her hand around the key. Old iron, worn smooth at the head from years of use, carrying in its surface the history of every hand it had passed through. She thought about a painted porch, a closed door, the dust of the main street, and Wren's hand tight in hers. "No," she said. "It isn't enough." She held Harriet's gaze steadily. "But I know what it cost you to climb up here, and I'm not going to pretend I don't." Something in Harriet's face shifted. Not relief, because the relief would take longer, would come in increments over the following months as she learned a different way of opening her doors. But something like the first acknowledgement that relief might eventually be possible. She walked back down the ridge. Marin watched her go and thought about the widow with 2 boys who had gone north years before and come back missing most of what she'd left with. She thought about how Harriet had been carrying that story for years, and how it had not been enough to change the decision she made when Marin arrived. And she thought about the specific mercy of second chances, not the comfortable kind, the kind that costs nothing, but the real kind, which requires you to see clearly what you did and do differently with that knowledge going forward. She hoped Harriet would do differently. She thought she probably would. Reverend Colt came at noon. He climbed the ridge with his hat in both hands and the specific bearing of a man who had been working up to something all morning and had decided that further delay was its own form of cowardice. He stopped a few feet from the entrance and looked at the clay walls, at the 18 inches of packed earth and salvaged timber and careful labor that had stood between 14 people and the worst night the valley could produce. "I preached about pride 2 Sundays ago," he said. "I was talking about other people. I understand now that I was describing myself." He looked at Marin directly. "I told you that Providence sets the hour. Then Providence sent everything you predicted, and I walked back inside my house. And the only reason I am standing here is because you built something better than my house." He paused. "I was wrong," he said. "Not about Providence, about where I thought wisdom came from, and who I thought was capable of having it." Marin looked at him for a long moment. He had expected she could see either absolution or rejection, the clean resolution of a man accustomed to moral accounting. She gave him neither. "The knowledge was my husband's first," she said. "He learned it from the earth and passed it on. I learned it from him and built on it. That's how it works. Someone pays attention, and then they give what they found to whoever is willing to use it." She paused. "I hope you'll use it, not just the building method, the paying attention." Reverend Colt put his hat back on and looked at the valley below for a moment. Then he looked at her again, with the face of a man who has just been given homework he knows he will be doing for the rest of his life. "I'll try," he said. "That's all it takes to start," she said. Nora Blaine came in the middle of the afternoon, with Thomas beside her, and Embers trotting at his heel with the proprietary satisfaction of a dog who has recently acquired a devoted human and found the arrangement greatly to his liking. Thomas stopped in front of Marin and looked at her with the clear, level gaze of a child who has been through something and come out the other side with his eyes open wider than before. "Thank you for coal," he said. "His name is Embers," Marin said. Thomas glanced at the dog. The dog looked back with the ancient, patient expression that had been in his eyes since the waste pile. "He likes coal better," Thomas said without a trace of doubt. Embers thumped his tail against the snow. "All right," Marin said. "Coal." Nora Blaine had been standing slightly behind her son, watching the exchange with the particular attention of a woman witnessing something she wants to remember exactly. When Thomas moved off to sit with Embers on the warm granite shelf, she stepped forward. "I have been unkind," Nora said. "Not just to you. To anyone who made me feel uncertain, I have been unkind, because certainty was the only comfort I knew how to reach for." She paused. Thomas not speaking. That was the most frightening thing I have ever experienced. And watching your daughter sit beside him without asking anything of him, watching that dog be exactly what he needed. She stopped. "I would like to learn how to do that." "Do what?" Marin asked. "Give people what they need without making them pay for it first." Marin looked at her for a long moment. This was the same conversation as "teach me how to build one of these." Different words, same meaning. A person arriving at the edge of who they had been and deciding to step across. "Come by tomorrow," Marin said. "Bring Thomas. We'll start with the clay." Marshal Grundy came last, as the light was going gold and low, and the temperature was dropping again with the clean, honest fall of an ordinary winter evening. He carried his leather folder under his arm, and Marin watched him climb the ridge with the measured pace he'd always used. She noticed that it no longer made her feel anything in particular. Not the cold dread of the first visit, not the sharp anger of Aldrich's revelation, just the clear recognition of a man who had done what he had done, and was now here to deliver a document. He stopped in front of her and held out a paper without preamble. "The land claim is registered in your name," he said. "The section you're on. And my surveying request for the adjacent sections has been formally withdrawn. Your counsel can verify that independently." A pause. "The land around yours remains uncontested, yours to document and claim if you choose." Marin took the paper. She looked at it. Her name, in clear black letters, on land she had tested and built and lived on and nearly lost. She folded it carefully and put it in her coat pocket beside her husband's letter. "The paperwork was always in order," Grundy said. "I just hadn't processed it." Marin looked at him steadily. He was using the carefully constructed phrase that was technically true and practically dishonest. The version of events that let him stand in front of her without having to say the plainer thing. "You waited," she said. "You came to my shelter and threatened my daughter to make me frightened enough to leave. And then when I didn't leave, you filed a survey of the adjacent sections because you wanted to take the knowledge once it was proven." She said it without heat, without triumph, just as the sequence of events as they had actually occurred. "That's what happened." Grundy was quiet. "I'm not going to tell you whether you're a bad man or a man who made a bad choice," Marin continued. "I don't think that distinction matters very much to the people it affects. What matters is what you do next." She held his gaze. "So, what do you do next?" He looked at her for a long moment. Something was happening in his face. Not transformation, not the clean arc of redemption that tidy stories provide. Something slower and less certain than that. The beginning, perhaps, of a man deciding to take a different kind of inventory than he was accustomed to taking. "I don't know yet," he said. It was, Marin thought, the most honest thing he had said to her since the day they met. "Then go figure it out," she said, "and leave my daughter's name out of any future calculations." Grundy nodded once. He turned and walked down the ridge, and his footsteps crunched in the new snow for a long time, getting smaller, until they were gone entirely. Wren appeared at the entrance behind her. "Will he come back?" she asked. "No," Marin said. "Is that all right?" Marin looked out at the valley, at the long gold shadows the evening was laying across the snow, at the warm creek threading dark through white, at the steam still rising from the high ridge, patient, constant, the earth still doing what it had been doing before any of them arrived, and what it would go on doing long after all of them were gone. "Yes," she said. "That's all right." She took her daughter's hand. They went inside. The wedding happened in the shelter 3 weeks later, when the worst of the cold had passed. It was a small thing, which was exactly what both of them wanted, which was one of the many ways in which Soren had turned out to be the right person for the particular shape of Marin's life. He proved, over the years, to be exactly the kind of man who got better with time. Not dramatic about it, just steadily, quietly better, the way good timber seasons. Reverend Colt officiated with a conscientiousness that had not been present in his manner before the storm. He spoke slowly and chose his words with care. Aldrich witnessed. He stood very straight and wrote his name in ink that he blew on carefully to dry. And then he shook Soren's hand with both of his own and said something quietly that made Soren look at the floor and then back up with the expression of a man who has been recognized accurately and found it unexpectedly moving. Bassett stood at the entrance with his arms crossed and his expression carefully neutral and his eyes doing something that he would have firmly denied if anyone had mentioned it. Wren had braided dried grasses into a loop and placed it around Ember's neck before the ceremony, explaining seriously to the dog that he had an important role to play and she trusted him to perform it with appropriate gravity. Embers received this information with the deep dignity of an animal that understood he was being relied upon and intended to come through. He sat perfectly still throughout the entire ceremony. He only moved once when Wren started to cry, quietly, quickly, the way children cry at things that are too big for them to hold all at once. And he leaned his gray muzzle against her knee and stayed there until she put her hand on his back and her breathing steadied. Soren held both of Marin's hands when he made his promises. He made them slowly, with the deliberateness of a man who had thought carefully about each word and had no intention of saying one he couldn't keep. His hands were warm and steady and entirely present. Wren waited until the promises were finished. Then she said clearly, from her position beside Embers, "Papa would have liked him, Mama." Maren looked at her daughter, at the serious, certain face, at the complete absence of doubt in it, not the false certainty of someone who hasn't thought about it, but the earned certainty of someone who has thought about it carefully and arrived at a conclusion she is prepared to stand behind. Yes, Maren said, he would have. Time moved in the way that time moves in stories when the hardest part is over. Maren taught anyone who asked, which after the night of the storm meant a great many people. She taught without charge and without condition, because the knowledge had not come to her with conditions and she saw no reason to attach them. She taught the way her husband had taught her, by doing, by explaining, by insisting that the student understand the principle rather than copy the practice, because a copy only works in one situation and a principle works in all of them. High ground, moving air. The heavy gas flows downhill. Test before you build. The earth will heat whatever you give it something to hold. By the end of that season, there were 3 more shelters on the ridge. The following winter, the knowledge had traveled to the neighboring camps. The winter after that, further still. Maren did not track where it went because she had not given it in order to keep count of where it landed. She had given it because that was what her husband had done, and his father before him, and the person before that whose name she didn't know, but whose knowledge had been passed carefully forward until it reached the man who gave it to the woman who built the shelter that held 14 people through the worst night the valley had ever seen in a story like this one, and sent them back out into the world carrying something they hadn't had before. Knowledge travels that way, not in straight lines, not always to the people who seem most likely to use it, but it travels if the people who have it are willing to give it without requiring anything in return. Wren grew up on the granite shelf. She grew up with the fissure breathing below her bedroom floor and the mineral warmth in the air that she associated all her life with safety, with the specific safety of a place that held because it had been built to hold, not because the world had decided to be kind. She learned everything her mother knew, and a considerable amount more, that she worked out for herself, because her mind ran naturally toward the question beneath the question, toward the principle that explained the instance rather than the instance itself. She became a teacher, not just of the building method, but of the wider practice from which the method came, how to read the world honestly, how to test what you think you know, how to build something real from materials that other people have decided are worthless, how to open a door when the people who laughed at you come knocking in the cold. She had her mother's stillness and her father's warmth, and something that was purely her own, a way of making the people she taught feel that the knowledge they were receiving was something they had always been capable of, that it had been waiting inside them for the right person to point at it and say, that is real, that will hold. Her classroom, if you could call it that, was the ridge itself. She taught outdoors whenever the weather allowed, which was most days because she had her mother's tolerance for cold. With students crouched beside test fissures while she watched their faces, not their hands, she wanted to see the moment understanding arrived. It was different in every person, a stillness in some, a sudden exhalation in others, a child's wide eyes when the candle flame leaned sideways in warm air and didn't gutter. The smell of clay and sulfur and cold granite became, for a generation of students, the smell of learning, the smell of being trusted with something real. One of her students, a quiet, watchful boy who reminded her of Thomas, asked her once why she always made them test things themselves instead of just telling them the answer. "Because told knowledge belongs to the person who told you," she said. "Tested knowledge is yours." She had not planned to say it. It had come from somewhere older than herself. Embers grew old slowly and comfortably, in possession of all the warmth he had ever wanted. In his later years, he developed a preference for lying directly over the fissure on cold mornings, which gave him the appearance of an ancient philosopher engaged in deep and rewarding contemplation. Wren told the children she taught that he was thinking, and that there was much to learn from an animal that knew where the warmth was and went there without apology. When the time came, he chose it with the same quiet dignity he had carried since the waste pile, since the cut rope, since the moment Wren had crouched beside him and offered something without asking anything in return. He went to his place over the fissure on a still winter morning, and he lay down, and he did not wake up. The story gave him exactly the ending that fit him. Wren carved the epitaph herself on a flat piece of granite at the eastern edge of the shelf, using the small chisel her mother had bought her years before when she first showed an interest in the way stone could hold a mark. "He was warm when we were cold. He was here." She stood back and read it twice. Then she sat beside it for a long time with her hand on the stone, not moving, not crying, just being present with something that deserved to be sat with. Maren sat beside her and said nothing. Some things don't require words. Some griefs are complete enough as they are, and the kindest thing another person can do is simply stay. Thomas, who had become, over the years, something between a neighbor and a member of the family, the way certain people become, came and stood at the edge of the shelf for a while. He did not say anything either. He put his hand briefly on the stone. Then he went home. Some relationships are built in the dark on the worst nights, when nobody is performing for anyone. Those are the ones that last. There was an afternoon, years later, when the shadow of the shelf was long and gold, and a grandchild, Wren's daughter, 6 years old, with her grandmother's serious face and her great-grandmother's way of going very still when she was thinking about something important, was sitting on the warm granite watching the vapor rise from the fissure. She had been watching it for several minutes. The way she watched things she was genuinely trying to understand. "Was great-grandmother scared?" she asked. Maren sat down beside her on the warm stone. She had more gray now than not. Her hands showed the years in the way that hands that have done real work show years. Not diminished, just marked. Honest. She looked at the vapor rising from the fissure. Still patient, still constant, still carrying heat from somewhere deep in the earth that winter had never reached and never would. "Every single day," she said. The girl considered this with the seriousness it deserved. Then how did she do it? Maren looked at the valley below, at the shelters visible from the ridge, their clay walls weathered now to the color of the earth around them, so settled into the landscape that it was difficult to imagine they had ever not been there. At the creek, threading dark through the lower ground, warm as it had always been. at the long shadows of the afternoon reaching across the snow. She paid attention, Marin said. When everyone else was talking, she watched. When everyone else had already decided what was possible, she tested it herself. She built when people told her not to. She stayed when leaving would have been easier. She paused. And when the people who laughed at her came knocking in the cold, she opened the door, the girl said. She had heard parts of this story before and knew where certain paths led. She opened the door, Marin said, every time, without making them earn it first. Not because they deserved it. Some of them didn't, not yet. But because she had decided a long time before that night what kind of person she was going to be. And that kind of person opens the door. The girl was quiet for a moment, turning this over. Then she reached out and held her small hand over the fissure, palm down, the way she had watched her grandmother do it, the way her grandmother had watched her mother do it on the first cold morning of the first difficult winter. Feeling the warmth rise against her palm, testing it. "It's warm," she said, with the quiet certainty of someone confirming something they already knew. "It's always warm," Marin said. "That's the thing about the earth. It doesn't change what it is because the season gets hard. It keeps doing what it does, all the way down where the cold can't reach." She paused. That's what she learned. That's what she built on. The girl lowered her hand and looked at it. Then she looked at her grandmother. "Will you teach me?" she asked. Marin looked at the small hand, the serious face, the clear eyes that held the particular quality of someone at the beginning of a long and useful life. $43 and an address that had burned down, clay walls and a candle flame burning straight and yellow. A child asking, "Can we really live here?" And a woman answering without knowing yet whether the answer was true. The distance between that morning and this warm stone, and all the hands that had passed the knowledge forward, her husband's, his father's, the unknown someone before that, and her own, and Wren's, and now these small certain hands that were ready to receive it. "Yes," she said, "I'll teach you everything." The fissure breathed below them. The valley held its late afternoon gold. The steam rose patient and faithful from the earth, as it had before any of them arrived, and as it would long after all of them were gone, offering warmth to anyone willing to build something real enough to hold it. The earth never lies. It is true in every story where someone decides that what they know is worth more than what they have been told to believe. It is true whenever a woman who has been dismissed builds something from nothing and opens the door, without condition, to the very people who closed theirs against her. If you are in your own cold season, your own ridge, your own closed doors, your own version of standing in the dust with everything you have left in one bag and a child's hand in yours. Pay attention, build on high ground, keep the air moving, and when the people who doubted you come knocking in the dark, open the door she would have wanted you to,